That depends on the student's discipline area. So I think for students in music, whether they're doing composition, musicology, performance, education or jazz, that they should actually put forward themselves first as a musician. So short compositions that they may have created, perhaps a performance, which could be a video or a sound file. It could even be them working with students, so showing their expertise as a musician, not just as artist, but a musician as teacher as well. But I think it's really discipline specific if they want to create the portfolio to be not just a showcase of who they are, but a showcase of their abilities and skills that they've developed over a period of time.
I think the students ideally will put in things that look backwards and things that look forwards. So they find it very useful to put in examples of work and things that they've done that gives them a kind of personal archive that they can refer to over time. But also ideally they're starting to think about how they might use those materials in the future. So that might also be projecting their professional self into the portfolio with something like a capacity statement.
Portfolio as a tool should be very personal, and we shouldn't see portfolios that look the same. So they should reflect an individual's capabilities and skills and personality. So in a way, I think the e-portfolio being an electronic resource opens up a lot of avenues for students to show themselves in a range of different formats that aren't necessarily stagnant. I think portfolios and e-portfolios should be seen as a fluid. It's an operational process. It engages them at their own level at the time at which they're working, and trains them and educates them and raises awareness about how and why they should reflect and talk about themselves. I think if they're instructed well in creating a portfolio that is reflective, then I think that is an excellent example of how they're encouraged to engage with their learning on a very personal level. And as musicians or creative and performing artists, the more that they can reflect, analyse, improve and move through that cycle of learning is a good thing. Do I think that e-portfolios are a vehicle or a tool for a way a student learns better? Yes, I do. I think initially as a career objective, so perhaps applying for a job or working with other musicians in an ensemble, that's a possibility as well. But you don't want the e-portfolio to only have that label of being career focused. I think that as a learning tool it has great applicability across a range of disciplines, but I think particularly for a creative or performing artist, then it actually allows them to synthesise and see their learning in a holistic way. And the more that they see learning in a holistic way, I think they're probably more likely to engage in that learning and produce then their own interpretation of the learning. Quite often I see students e-portfolios and almost don't recognise that student because they're quite different to the way they talk or interact with with classes.
Yeah, it was interesting for the writing students. They were also third year, so final year students in a capstone unit. So I did a similar degree stage to Diana's students. And what they came to realise was that, in fact, their portfolio may not go to a potential employer. It might be used for potential clients. They may be having to pitch their skills to somebody who was looking for some short-term work or a project. So our students began to amass materials that showed particular skills. So we had one student who put in some writing that she'd done for media. Another student did a mock TV interview as if she was presenting a feature in the news. And they started to give real concrete video type examples of things that they're good at. So that was a bit different, because once they stopped thinking about the employer and started to think about the client, all of a sudden their thinking shifted.
So a performing, I mean, I can see 3 years of performance documentation, especially through DVD, a student leaving and then being able to say to an agent, here's a start, here's 3 years of my gigs and at the university, nice diversity there. So I think there's a lot of potential.
We found that students really need to work out for themselves where the e-portfolio is going to be of a benefit. Our students have access to their e-portfolio as graduates, and that's been very important, so that they know they can use the platform as a personal archive and as an assessment tool, or as a platform on which they can put their assessments. The third year students will say, I wish I'd been introduced to this in first year, because then I'd have been able to assemble a portfolio of materials throughout the last 3 years, rather than having to dig around in my computers and thumb drives trying to find things that I've done. But the first year students, often it's harder, I think, to get them engaged, because they're not really yet thinking about after university. They're thinking about now in my first year. So that's changed, because the portfolio, the e-portfolio, gives them something that they can keep and keep building on right the way through their degree. And we couldn't ever do that with a hard copy item. So that's changed completely.
The idea that an assessment task previously was done and discarded, I think the e-portfolio allows that assessment task to be almost chopped up and used in a variety of different ways for the students' uses. I think my teaching has been affected by that technology and that availability. I think also that I feel a need to understand what other lecturers and other units of study are actually doing as far as holistic learning for their students. I think that has helped me as a teacher to become more aware of other practices, and has encouraged me to design and redesign and evaluate and reevaluate the tasks as I've had that sort of experience.
For me personally, knowing that there is something that gives students the ability to amass material and to easily find it, to invite people to view it, their peers or their lecturers, or potential employers and clients, even in first year, has changed the way I teach. Simply because I know that resource is there for them, and that's something that they will take advantage of if they see, crikey, that's a really good way of keeping my things together. And if that's all they're thinking in first year, that's fine, because they're at least starting to use the platform. And as they begin to think about life as a graduate in second and especially in final year, or as they go on to fourth year in some degrees, then it becomes more real and their use of it changes. So directing them to include things in their portfolio, or even to upload assessment items into a portfolio compatible format, is different for me. I wouldn't have thought to teach that way before.
But I think particularly looking through the students' e-portfolios and seeing what sort of material they're placing on there beyond the assessment tasks, how they're interpreting the tool, has also given me good ideas for teaching and encouraging them to to continue with the way they're blogging or the way that they're reflecting or the way that they're collecting. Perhaps I've moved away from very closed, traditional ways of teaching. So, for example, write me an essay, write me a report. And I've gone into more project-based assessment. So where the students are having choices and they're having input. I'm using a lot more of my own research in the way that I teach. So research-led teaching, I think, has become more prominent in the way that I approach something. And I think that the students' negotiation with me about individual interest areas has meant that I've been more flexible in the way that I've actually approached my teaching.
I find students, when they see something on their e-portfolio can look fairly professional in half an hour, can't it? Once they've got that photograph up and they've developed a capacity statement, they think, oh, that's me. And that changes the way you teach because students are now thinking differently.
In my unit, it has. It has broadened the curriculum and it has also narrowed it in a way. It's broadened it because it's allowed for the connection or the synthesis of a range of different areas, and with the e-portfolio being almost the location and the pivot around which this learning has happened, that's broadened it. I think it's narrowed it for a lot of the students because instead of them in a macro view looking at their learning as being, you know, I did and I achieved, I think they're now into the micro view that they actually understood and they learnt. And there's not a lot of students that I think reflect back on their studies and pick up, you know, a general idea about what they learnt. They tend to say, well, in this subject I did this, in that subject I did that. Oh, I do remember one funny thing that happened. So everything by them is incident or event based. I think that the e-portfolio in a narrowing way has made that different to, you know, incident or event based, and I think it's sort of given them language and opportunity to discuss their actual skills and learning. There is discussion about benefits and challenges of all learning that's assisted by technology. Because I focus on the pedagogical process and the pedagogical benefits, I think that a lot more has been about engaging the student in their own learning and taking responsibility for it. So the discourse is about students creating their own opportunities, creating their own learning, being a part of their learning environment. And I'm not talking about the physical learning environment, I'm talking about their actual learning context. And I think that that has been assisted by the introduction of e-portfolios and an institutional adoption of e-portfolios. We now have opportunities that have been placed in front of us to really, you know, take our students into 21st century learning. And I think that's a good thing.